Good morning, First E. I really hate that I can't be there with you in person, but as you all know, this COVID-19 stuff has us all living lives very different from the lives we lived just a couple of months ago. But I look forward to seeing you soon, I hope, and looking forward to bringing today's message to you. I know I'm going to miss not being able to talk to you after the message and hearing your thoughts and your comments, but definitely call me if you feel you'd like to chat a little bit. I'm certainly interested in hearing what you think and what you feel about today's message. So I'm going to begin. The message for today is the human spirit in times of crises, a historical perspective. Often, out of crises, devastation, and loss, come knowledge. An awareness of self of sorts that is different from that preceding the triggering event. For many of us in Atlanta, indeed, around the state and country, and around the world, the past couple of months represent a crisis, the likes of which none of us has experienced in our lifetimes. The entire world effectively locked down. In an extraordinary show of fear, worry, and compassion, the collective human race focused on how best to stop in its tracks and eradicate the so-called enemy, COVID-19. Perhaps like many of you, I was at first intrigued by the disease. I tracked its movement by listening to news reports on various media outlets during my lunch breaks and on my drive home from work. It was clear to me that it would eventually make its way to the United States. When we learned of the first COVID-19 related death in Washington state back in late February, I purchased latex gloves and began wearing them when I bought lunch from the buffet-style restaurant in my building's food court. I remember feeling odd wearing them, as in early March, only a handful of people were taking what at that time we considered to be protective measures. Then, on March 12th, my employer informed us we would be working from home that Friday, March 13th. Friday became Tuesday, Tuesday became March 31st, March 31st became April 30th, and well, April 30th became June 9th. And I guess we'll see what happens as we approach that date. Initially, I was grateful for the opportunity to work from home, given that my day generally begins at 5 a.m. at the gym. The thought of sleeping in a bit and working in pajamas while listening to music and watching a favorite TV show was exceedingly appealing. Also, my lunch breaks would be a lot more flexible, and I could get out and take a walk around the neighborhood if I needed to stretch my legs. And of course, making lunch at home and having enough leftovers for dinner also meant I might save a few dollars and eat a little more healthily than I try to under normal circumstances. The benefits really seemed endless. But then, cities around the world and here in the United States, particularly my home city, New York, began counting numbers of COVID-19 related infection and death that seemed really mind-boggling. When I learned of the first case in New Rochelle, New York, right outside New York City, I immediately called a college friend and her family. In fact, I called all my friends and family in New York. COVID-19 became a thing. It was becoming real in my life. So in the weeks that followed, the dizzying numbers of infection and death in this country and around the world prompted me to think about COVID-19 in a more holistic and even a more metaphysical way. I began to take exception to those in media and in government referring to the disease as the quote-unquote enemy. The assumption that we would win the fight against an unseen enemy, as dubbed by some, began to infuriate me. Why, I thought, do human beings have the need to ascribe to themselves a position in nature that is always above everything else? Why does it seem that we are innately uncomfortable with being equal to everything else in nature, or, God forbid, beneath something else in nature? Over the course of those weeks, I spent a lot of time thinking about and casually reviewing some history about pandemics of the past on one of my favorite websites, history.com. Not surprisingly, I learned quite a bit. The first plague of interest, although there had been many others before it, was the plague of Justinian in 541 AD. It began in Constantinople and at its peak claimed about 10,000 lives a day. So great were the numbers of dead bodies that many were piled in buildings or just left to rot on streets. Even after its decline, the plague lasted for several years. It reached Europe, Africa, and Asia, and is believed to have claimed the lives of up to 25 million people. The Black Death that many of us learned about in high school began in 1347 in Eastern Europe. The plague eventually ended in Western Europe in 1353, about 6 or 7 years, but not before wiping out entire villages and more than half of the European population, approximately 50 million people. And while this plague devastated Europe, historians apparently believe that it was beneficial to lower classes who saw opportunity for social advancement due to labor shortages. A plague we seldom, if ever, identify as such is the plague initiated by Christopher Columbus and his crew of so-called explorers. When they landed on the island of Hispaniola, present-day Haiti and Dominican Republic, in 1492, the indigenous Taino peoples numbered about 60,000. In just over 5 decades, their population had been reduced to less than 500. This scenario, of course, would repeat itself on other islands and lands in the Caribbean and Latin America. In the 1600s, there was the Italian Plague, 1629 to 1631, and the Great Plague of London, 1665 to 1666. And in the 1700s, the Great Plague of Marseille, 1720 to 1722. In 1855, the third plague pandemic, as it is called, was identified in Yunnan province in China. It did not end effectively until the 1950s. And while it mostly impacted China and India, this plague reached all continents, including cases in South Africa and in San Francisco. During each of these pandemics or plagues, tens or sometimes even hundreds of millions of people died. Lives and economies were severely disrupted, sometimes permanently, and survivors were tasked with navigating the challenging social realities that lay in the wake of each one. In the early 20th century, from 1918 to 1919, the Spanish flu pandemic altered the course of history. Known by that name only because Spain did not have wartime news blackouts in place, as did other European countries during World War I, this strain of flu was first noticed in Europe, the United States, and Asia, and spread quickly around the world. Tens of millions of people died, roughly 3% of the world's population. So what's the point, you might ask? Well, as I get older, I increasingly see myself not exclusively as a human being, but as a living organism joined with other living organisms of all forms, integrally connected to a living universe. As such, I am acutely aware of the universe's need to change, to expand, to grow. And growth always implies death. Now, by death, I do not mean that there always must be physical death, although that is certainly possible, and pandemics, whether experienced by humans or any other life form, certainly claim lives. But death for me represents much more. Attitudes and behaviors can die. Weaknesses and/or perceived strengths can die. Physical and/or mental abilities can die. Limiting and/or destructive beliefs also can die. There was a time in human history during which natural events like hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, and volcanic activity were ascribed to a pantheon of gods and goddesses. Some humans still believe so. Scientifically, though, we have a much deeper understanding of these events. We also know how, despite their so-called destructive nature, they benefit the planet in numerous ways. They are necessary elements in this physical reality. I ask myself the question, what might be the planet's needs for pandemics? What might they provide? Many of you know that my thinking is never far removed from some aspect of Black history and culture. As I prepared for today's message, it occurred to me that I'd be speaking to you on the 66th anniversary of the Supreme Court's ruling in the matter of Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. In theory, the court's unanimous decision struck down the decades-old tradition of separate and unequal education in public schools in the South and across the country. For some reason, we always want to think of these things as only occurring in the South, but they certainly occurred in other parts of the country. White supremacy and Black disenfranchisement, pandemics of another variety, if you will, had long been responsible for the illnesses and deaths of millions of Black people in this country, and still are. I insert here the memory of Ahmaud Arbery. For while many of us really do want to believe that these pandemics are dying out, as many throughout history have, I find it more than a little ironic that one pandemic, COVID-19, is shining a bright light on others. The disparities in healthcare, housing, employment, education, and financial stability in the Black community, and the fear for one's safety are deeply entrenched in the American experience, in the so-called American dream. For this pandemic, this strain of illness, there seems to be no vaccine or cure. As I spent time learning about the many pandemics that impacted humans over millennia, two things stood out. One, I did not come across one that lasted for hundreds of years or consistently and successfully morphed into others. In this, white supremacy and Black disenfranchisement seem unique and particularly virulent. And two, human beings always endure, regardless. To my way of thinking, we may not be much unlike our distant human relatives who, in their lack of knowledge, surrendered their understanding of natural events to gods and goddesses. If that be true, I wonder what those distant life forms will be that look back on us and our limited understanding of naturally occurring events with incredulity, laughing and finding it hard to believe that we did not know what the hell was really going on. Thank you, First E. As always, I love you. Please be safe and healthy, and I'm looking forward to the day when we can see each other again. Thank you.